Hey, everybody. Welcome to Muck Rack Live. I'm Greg Galant, the co-founder and CEO of Muck Rack. So glad you could all be here. I'm really excited for our guest today, Sara Fischer, who you'll be hearing from shortly. Before we bring Sara on, I want to first just give you a couple little bit of context about what we're doing here today, and then do a very quick couple-minute history of newsletters. So to start, remember the hashtag Muck Rack Live, just like it shows in my lower third. And you can see, you can tweet or share your questions on whatever platform you're watching or listening on. We're broadcasting to Twitter, LinkedIn. I'm not sure about TikTok, but pretty much every social platform that's out there. So ask us your questions and I'll read them off to Sara as we get into the interview. But first, I'm going to give you a quick history of newsletters. So we scoured the history books and found the first example of a newsletter was the Aquaderna. This was in ancient Rome. It was actually the first newsletter writer was Julius Caesar. He doesn't get enough credit. He's known as a dictator, as a general, politician, but nobody thinks of him as a newsletter writer. Yet when he was involved in the Gallic Wars, he realized he needed to build support back in Rome and would send his newsletter back to Rome. Of course, it was before the printing press, so they'd write it up and post it for the public so people could read and have it read out loud. And it was a key tool in his kind of propaganda machine to build up popularity for himself with the Roman people. Up next, we're going to fast forward a bit in history to 1704, the first newsletter in the US, which was in the Boston Newsletter. If you remember, people used to do the dash and email, and now we write it email. Same with newsletter. Back in 1704, they thought they had to hyphenate newsletter. And, by the time any of us knew it, we all know that newsletter is now commonly done as one word, but maybe we'll go retro one day. After that, another famous newsletter writer, Ben Franklin, who wrote the Poor Richard's Almanac, which was one of the most famous newsletters of all time and still a good read if you go back for it. Then we got into content marketing newsletters. So Johnson & Johnson started a newsletter in 1888. It's funny how so many of us think of content marketing and the idea of brand doing a newsletter is this new trendy thing, but dates back to 1888. Then there was this kind of dearth in innovation in newsletters. Really nothing notable happened for over a century. And then in 2010, we got the Muckrack Daily. This is the exclusive coverage that Peter Kafka had in All Things D when we launched the Muckrack Daily just about a decade ago. And it was the first newsletter that focused on what journalists were tweeting about the news and, focused on tweets at all as a way to construct a newsletter. And this has been a huge part of Muckrack's success. We have over 150,000 subscribers to the Muckrack Daily and many more to our LinkedIn newsletter, the Muckrack Weekly, too. And then, of course, one of everyone's favorite newsletters is the Axios Media Trends, written by Sara Fischer, who's a wonderful journalist and who's been, now we know her for Axios, both for the newsletter and her article work there. But her resume is pretty much every media brand you care about. She's worked before this. She was at the Washington Post. Before that, at the New York Times. And earlier in her career, she worked both for CNN and also Politico. So what better experience could we have? We want to highlight just some of her recent blockbuster articles. The first one that we pulled up through the Muckrack Analytics is her article about Snapchat's voter registration feature, which, as you can see, these are the stats we pulled from Muckrack, that it was popular both in the journalism community and also with people in general on Twitter. The next article that we pulled out was an exclusive of hers about Facebook cracking down on political content disguised as local news, which again had a really big impact in the journalism community and beyond. So again, we couldn't be more excited to have Sara Fischer here today to dig into what everyone needs to know about newsletters. Sara, welcome to Muck Rack Live.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
So I'd love to hear, Sara, tell me about what led you to want to come to Axios. You know, when you joined, it was still a bit more of a startup, certainly not as storied yet as the Washington Post, though it seems like that's changing. What made you want to take the leap from the Post?
Yeah, well, I'd known the folks, as you mentioned, from Politico, and I really liked them and I really trusted them. And it seemed like a great idea to just continue my career with them. And I also was eager to try a startup. I'd worked at a bunch of, storied publications where there was a lot of built-in infrastructure, and I wanted to get some experience learning how to build something. So this, I thought, would be a really good fit. And I also just wanted to say before I continued that I've been following the work that you've been doing at Muck Rack for so long, and I've been a loyal subscriber to your newsletter. So it's really exciting for me to be here with you as well.
Well, thanks so much for saying that, Sara. We've got it's good to know that we're mutual subscribers here. And I've always been a junkie for media news, so I've followed your work for a very long time too. And now, tell me, one thing I'm really curious about is when you were talking to Axios about jumping over there, was part of the deal that they want to hire you to write a newsletter, or did you come to Axios and then the idea was hatched after you were there already writing there?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I had been in sales when I had previously worked for this crew at Politico. And so the first conversation is like, what am I going to do for this company? Am I going to be an editorial? Am I going to be in business? I'd done so many different things that we were trying to figure that out. And so we eventually settled on, yes, I was going to be in editorial. And then what that looked like, we weren't sure. We talked about a newsletter. We talked about writing for the website. But I had gotten to that company so early that we didn't fully have sketched it out exactly what every product was going to be. So the newsletter conversation happened a few months in.
Very cool. And it's so interesting that you moved from sales to editorial. That's so rare. Just tell me, what was that like? I mean, you probably don't get a commission being a journalist. So how did it feel to give up that chance at a commission, and what sales skills were you able to bring to the journalism world?
I actually think they're very similar professions. I have this theory that there's frontline positions and backline positions. On the front line, it's any job that you do where you're interacting with people externally. So that could be a client, it could be sources, etc. It could be going on stages, whatever it is. And in the backline, those are people who help the people on the front line to do their jobs. So they're account managers, people who are filling out back-end sales requests. They're producers, people who are helping the people that are on camera or on a podcast produce their show, or they're editors, people who are editing the work of the reporters whose bylines are externally facing. And I realized pretty early on that I'm a frontline person. I'm a people person. I like to do media, as I'm doing now. I like to be doing public speaking, and I like to be held accountable publicly for my work. And so because of that, a sales job was suitable for me. I was able to do frontline work. I was held accountable to a number, and as well as reporting. I feel like it's very similar. They're very similar roles. They're both jobs where you have to be developing pipelines. A huge part of reporting, in my opinion, is developing pipelines for how you're going to continuously break stories. It's not enough to just break one story and then wait a few months. You need to have constant things percolating. And so developing a reporting pipeline is actually very similar to developing a sales pipeline, where you are constantly taking meetings and constantly doing research to figure out what's the next story you break, or what's the next deal that you break. So that's kind of how I see both positions being very similar and very aligned. And then in terms of jumping over into editorial, you're right in that editorial, you're not going to have the same necessary financial commissions. But what you do have is you have the ability to build a bigger brand for yourself that perhaps one day you can cash in a different way. Maybe one day you could write a book, or maybe one day you can do a paid speaking engagement. And so the money, I think, actually turns out to be about the same long term if you play your cards right. I think the key difference, though, why I wanted to leave sales and go into editorial is I love media, but when I was in sales, especially for some organizations, you're only selling one or two types of media. You're selling digital, maybe you're selling events. Right now, I can report on everything. I can report on digital and events and print and newsletters and radio and podcasts, and it just gives me a little bit of a broader scope, if you will.
What a fun beat. And it's funny. I in my company, I employ both lots of salespeople and editorial, and I never thought of like kind of that sales quota and the editorial deadline and the editorial audience as being similar things, where you're kind of this individual contributor with this very public metric that you get held accountable for. And so with that, when you were when you hatched the idea for this newsletter, and I'm sure there are a lot of people listening, both journalists and people on the brand side, thinking what's their newsletter strategy, because that's just you were the early adopter, but now it seems like everyone has a newsletter. But what do people have to think about? People who are used to just publishing to the web, doing social, but now they want to start a newsletter and they're new to the newsletter game. Just where do you start in kind of conceptualizing what's a good newsletter and thinking about your audience development strategy?
Well, a lot of the credit really goes to the folks at Axios, because they have developed the newsletter strategy since day one. Mike Allen has been doing a newsletter for the past 14 years, every single day, sometimes twice a day, even on holidays. And one of the things that they found after doing this for a long time is that the newsletter needs to feel really easy to consume, and it needs to be delightful to consume. And so when you think about things that meets our expectations of what's delightful, it's not big chunks of text. Oftentimes it's text that's broken up with bullets, with bolds, with pictures, with graphs, with big headlines. And so I remember in the early days of Axios, we actually drew on a whiteboard what we thought a story should look like. It should have a headline that's this big. It should have a big, beautiful graphic that's really well done. It should have choppy text so that the eye gets a break when it's reading through it. And so when I think about the newsletter, the first thing I actually try to do is actually draw it out. How many stories am I going to have? If it's the day before Thanksgiving, I might not want that many stories, because I'm thinking, okay, what is this person doing? They're on the road, they're traveling, they're picking up a turkey. Like, they can't get through that much stuff. But if it's the day before the election, maybe they're craving information and they're going to be expecting a little bit more. So the first thing I do is decide, like, how long is it going to be? Then I kind of try to figure out, okay, what are the stories I have and what are the visual elements that go with it? If I have 8 stories and 3 have charts, I don't want the chart stories all next to each other. I want to do a story with a big, beautiful image, then a chart, then maybe a story that has no multimedia, then another image, then a photo, then a chart, just to kind of break it up so that the eye can have a really rich experience. The way I would describe it is everybody loves, a really hearty pasta meal, but what wouldn't be delicious is if you had like all pasta and then no sauce, no cheese. You kind of have to break it up and give everyone a little bit of everything. So that's kind of how I think about creating the newsletter. And then the last thing we'll say is that sometimes you have stories that require a lot of words. I mean, we don't write long at Axios. We call it smart brevity, but we still have stories that sometimes can be, a few hundred words. Don't include all of that in the newsletter. Give the reader a little bit of a snippet. And if it's interesting enough, post it somewhere else and link out, and that person can go find more information elsewhere.
And this is a very meta conversation, because you're both a newsletter writer, but then you cover the media. And there's this huge trend, both a lot of publications following Axios's lead in developing their own newsletters, and then journalists going independent using Substack, or I think it's Ghostery and these other platforms to write their own newsletters, sometimes charging for them. What do you think? Email is such an old technology. I mean, you could send an email newsletter as you said, for over a decade and a half. So why now? Why is it becoming so popular all of a sudden?
Well, one, email as a technology has improved. I think there was this pivotal moment when Google a few years ago separated the Gmail inbox between having promotions, social, and your main feed. It gave people a way to organize email as something that they can more practically sift through every single day. And so newsletters became more applicable to people's lives because email became a greater part of people's lives. So that was number one. Number two is that you had a lot of dynamics within the media industry that made it really hard for news outlets to rely on third-party distributors to get content. So Facebook, for example, in early 2018 said, we're no longer going to prioritize news content, and instead we're going to prioritize content that friends post. Well, that killed a lot of the traffic for news companies. And so news companies, seeing that social platforms could pull the rug out from underneath them, decided to create products where there wasn't going to be algorithm changes, products where they can speak directly to their audience. And so what do those products look like? I mean, some news companies experiment with text, some like text messages, some experiment with selling commerce directly to users, and others experiment with sending newsletters directly to consumers or podcasts directly to their consumers. I think it's just a way to be developing a more direct audience and not relying on third-party platforms.
What's your take on these journalists quitting their jobs, starting their own newsletters? Do you think it's a big trend? Do you think it's something that might get less not be sustainable? What's your take on it?
I think it's a really interesting trend that is really great for a few people. I mean, not everyone is going to be able to charge, whatever it is, $100 a year for a subscription and make enough money to support their living. So that's the big equation here. It's like, who has the ability to command an audience that's going to pay? And as more journalists make the leap, they're going to have more competition for those dollars. I think eventually we're going to come up with a system. That's why the Patreons of the world are really interesting, where you can pay creators a little bit ad hoc or at will for the ones that you want to support. OnlyFans is another example of that. So generally speaking, there is a trend of paying creators directly that's growing, and I think will continue to grow. But in terms of newsletters, I still think it's going to be a highly competitive environment. The one thing I think about for me all the time is, do you have also the ability to take risk? Some of these newsletter platforms like Substack are offering some writers in advance so that they can pay for things like health insurance while they build up a subscriber base. I am a risk-averse person, so it's not something that I can imagine myself doing. Even though people have said to me, if you do it, I'll pay. I don't know that I would ever have the ability. I don't know. I think I feel really risk-averse. I don't know that I would ever take the chance. And then the other thing that I don't know about it is that I spend my entire day co-bylining and talking to other reporters at Axios. If there's a story that I'm writing about, cognitive psychology and misinformation, we have an in-house science expert, our science reporter, who I can call and ask to team with me and provide me with sources, provide me with expertise so that my media side story of it is really strong. If I were to go out independently, it's not that I don't have those people to call, but they're not part of the same newsroom as me. They're not on the same team as me anymore. So it might be harder for me to collaborate. And in my opinion, the beauty of my product is that I'm the media reporter that represents the full energy and expertise of Axios. It's not just me and my brain. It's me bringing to you a combination of everybody's brains that I work with. That's, to me, what makes it so powerful. Me as an individual, I don't know that I'm going to deliver something that's as powerful as that if I don't have the support of that team.
Great point. And I want to pair one of my questions with the question we just got over Twitter. And the question is, first, for anyone out there thinking of doing a newsletter, like, what's your workflow? And it is, I think a lot of people start these and think it's going to be easy. I know you put a ton of work into it. So what's your usual workflow for the newsletter? And then our question is, has the glut of political stories and content lately changed Sarah's workflow or priorities in thinking about the media newsletter during the election cycle. So, what's the current system for you doing your newsletters? And of course, you write the media newsletter, not the political newsletter, but politics affects media. So how has that changed everything?
Such good questions. Well, I think the newsletter probably takes around 40 hours a week. And that's not the only thing I do for Axios. In fact, it's just a part of what I do. The other things I do is I report throughout the week. I report for a lot of other people's newsletters. Right now, as we speak, I'm trying to do a story for our political newsletter on political ad spend because advertising is part of what I cover. So what I try to do is as soon as it goes out on Tuesday, I think, okay, what stories did I miss or what stories did I have to bump that I could expand on for the following week? What current events are coming up that I need to pay attention to for the following week, like earnings or, big town halls, et cetera. And then finally, what are scoops that I have been hearing, tips I've been getting that I can chase? And so I lay out a schedule for myself as soon as I hit send Tuesday morning for what the following week is going to look like and how I'm going to prioritize my time. And so that's how I figure out the newsletter. And then I do the bulk of the writing over the weekend and on Monday. And part of the reason I save a lot of the writing then is because so much can change. On Tuesday morning, I might say, wow, this is going to be a huge trend. And then by Sunday, it's obsolete. So I try to save myself some time by waiting to hold off on the actual writing. In terms of politics, the one thing that I cover a lot is advertising. And, the combination of influence and money in politics is huge. And it really comes down to advertising. So that has been an increase of focus in the past year for sure. The other thing is we're trying to measure attention to this election in terms of ratings for town halls and debates and conventions, as well as social media attention and social media traction from the candidates. So that is something that I'm covering more now than I was covering in the past. And then the final thing is there's been some big existential crises around the role of the media in society. One of them has been that tech platforms are noticing that one of the biggest ways that people are interfering in the election is to try to game reporters and actual news outlets to report things that are hacked, things that are leaked. Sometimes they're trying to manipulate them with fake stories. These overarching trends matter to our democracy, but they are increasing as we lead up to the election, so I'm covering them more now. In terms of what's the percentage of stories, when I write that newsletter and I think about pictures and articles and text and how I break it up, I do the same thing with topics. I try to make, as we're leading up to the election, that top story usually will be about politics, but then I try to do something on deals, something on streaming, something on sports, all the way down, something on technology, maybe something on health that all relates to media so that the newsletter stays really diverse and vibrant and fresh. After the election, sure, I might spend a few more weeks dissecting it in terms of politics in the media, but I imagine, as we gear up into 2021 and there's more political hearings around technology, I might start to lead the newsletter with things that are more leaning heavily in towards things like deals or tech or business.
Very cool. And one question I saw that we got from Twitter from Bonnie Tab, sorry if I'm not pronouncing it right, but it was, what's the most effective way to grow your newsletter following? It's something I'm sure everyone struggles with after they start a newsletter. How do you get people to subscribe?
Yeah, that's a really big challenge, especially because there's so many newsletters out there. I focused really hard on boots on the ground organic growth. For the first 3.5 years up until the pandemic, while I was building this newsletter, I traveled a lot to different cities, different conferences, and I would just shake hands with people and I would talk to people and I would say, here's who I am. Follow me on Twitter. Please sign up for my newsletter. And I'd give them my business card. That's how I really grew the newsletter following. It was just hustle, hustle, hustle. We didn't put a lot of paid promotion around it. And that's because we wanted it to be a really loyal following. We wanted it to be people who would actually open it up. Now, the hard part about that is it's a slow burn. My newsletter following has increased like this, not like this, because we had to be really strategic about, not sort of baiting people into signing up, but getting people who really actually want to sign up. And that requires me to not only go to conferences and beg people, but also go to the right conferences and find the right people to talk to and get in front of the right audiences. I found that doing earned media, so things like this, where I do interviews and I talk to people, that's really helped me to develop an audience, because someone will see me on TV or they'll see me on a conference like this and they'll say, hey, she sounds interesting. Let me try signing up for her newsletter. And then the last thing I do, which is, I don't know that many people would think about this, but a huge part of my strategy in building my newsletter audience is getting my byline in other Axios newsletters. That's why a lot of the times I try so hard to partner with my colleagues, because the best way to tap into an audience that might not know mine but already trusts Axios is other Axios newsletters. So I'll try to write a lot of times for our technology newsletter, Axios Login, which has a lot of subscribers. And when they put my byline on that and they link out to my Media Trends sign up, I see a boost in subscribers there. Same thing when I put an article or I pitch an article for my boss, Mike Allen, for his newsletter. That's a huge way for me to build my subscriber base. Now, if you don't have a network of in-house newsletters and products to work off of, what I would recommend is go to your peers. Write something really compelling that maybe another competing newsletter might think is interesting enough that they would plug yours. And I do that for other newsletters. You know, Nick Qua, who I really love, who writes a podcast newsletter, I try to cite him a lot. That's another way to build up your subscriber base, is get cited by other people who are also writing newsletters.
That's cool. So you don't view other newsletters as competition, or maybe you do, but that you're still going to cooperate with them. Maybe they're more like frenemies in a way, where you want to cross promote.
I think in life, the best competition is to compete against yourself. If you view everyone around you as someone or something, an opportunity to get smarter as opposed to competition, you will get smarter, your product will be smarter, and you're going to attract people organically. And so, no, I don't view other newsletters as like competition. I view them as opportunities. And the only reporter I compete against is Sara Fischer, is me.
And you mentioned doing public speaking in person or now on forums like this is a good method. Where do people sign up for your newsletter?
Oh, I should have said that earlier. Signup.axios.com is where you would sign up.
Awesome. And we'll send a link around as well. Still have plenty more questions. So now you get these people signed up. And as you said, the great thing about newsletters is you're not at the mercy of an algorithm of a social media company, but you still have to battle with Google's Gmail to get out of the promotions tab and be seen in the primary inbox. How do you fight these email filters that Gmail and Outlook and all the other email providers have?
Yeah, it's a huge struggle. And one of the things that I found that can be a struggle is in covering internet trends, you have to cover things that sometimes have keywords that will put you in spam. So for example, pornography is a massive part of the internet. So there are times where we are going to cover internet trends in terms of like video consumption as it pertains to that vertical. Those words, the word pornography, might automatically send you into spam. So it's one, be conscious of the words that you use, and maybe instead of using pornography, you use adult entertainment, just to be able to make sure that you're not getting bumped to spam. Curse words a lot of times can get you bumped. So just think about how you can be as clean in your language as possible. Number two, when someone pulls you out of promotions and into their main feed, oftentimes it's because they've opened you a certain amount of times and they trust you, or because you've then developed a relationship with them outside of the inbox that's made them want to go and find your newsletter within their promotions tab and click it and open it. And so how do you develop that relationship with someone outside the inbox? It's doing all of those earned media things that I just said, getting on TV, getting in people's inboxes through other newsletters, doing interviews, etc. And the last thing I'll note is having a mobile-friendly newsletter makes a world of difference, because when you're looking through an email on your phone, there's no promotions tab, there's no separate tab the way you have on desktop. And so if people think your newsletter is really easy to consume on mobile, they'll just open it organically on their phones. And then when it does come time for them to maybe view email on their desktop, if they've opened it enough times on your phone, you should be moved over eventually.
Shalon Thomas from who's watching via YouTube Live right now asked, is it better to specialize in a specific area or write more general articles?
I'm a big believer in being a subject matter expert, because then you can develop a really high quality niche audience that's hyper loyal. When you're a generalist, you're competing with so many other generalists that it's hard for you to stand out. But there's a really smart way that you can marry a lot of your interests, if you have diverse interests, into one sort of niche product, which is come up with a product that's something you absolutely love, where you can develop an expertise in, like media or music or whatever. And then towards the bottom of it, you can sprinkle in other interests or other things that you want to talk about, but make the focus of your newsletter one topic, one area of expertise, because that allows you to develop the most hyper engaged audience possible.
Okay, we have another question from YouTube from Raj asking, what should be the normal size of a newsletter with graphics? And I guess what he's getting at is your point about it might be mobile. Like, what do you think about formatting wise when putting them together?
For dailies at Axios, we recommend no more than 1,200 words. And for weeklies, we recommend no longer than 2,000 words. If you can, try to get to 1,800. In terms of graphics, I think it doesn't matter how many you have, but really I would say no more than one per story. So if you have 8 items within those 2,000 words, don't do more than 8 graphics. The key with graphics is they have to be really good. They can't have bad quality. They have to be, if they're charts, they have to be really polished and clean. If your graphics aren't absolutely stunning, they're not worth including. And the graphics should be really applicable to the stories. When we talk to our visuals team about creating an illustration, we are having constant dialogue around what is the crux of the story? How does the visualization help tell the story? So I wouldn't include anything that's visual that doesn't help the reader understand what you're trying to get at.
We have another question from Emma, who's watching over Twitter and Periscope. What newsletters do you look for inspiration or just enjoy?
Well, definitely my boss is Mike Allen's. I think he's the best newsletter writer, period. And I think that he's just one of the best people that I know. So I look up to him and try to be like him every day. And then additionally, I look at all of the newsletters of my colleagues because we all have similar formats, but different tricks. And then from there, I look at all of the different newsletters of my peers. So, in the media space, like I mentioned, Nick Qua, who does a great podcasting newsletter. Dylan Byers is a great media and technology newsletter. I love the one that Business Insider does on media and advertising. Brian Stelter at CNN does a phenomenal job with Oliver Darcy pulling together a sort of general media list. I like the Ankler for entertainment. I like Lucas Shaw's entertainment newsletter at Bloomberg. I like what Alex Kantrowitz and Casey Newton do for their technology newsletter. Shira Ovide at the New York Times is a great technology newsletter. So the list really goes on, and I could name a bajillion more that I think are really, really good. But I start out by looking at Mike every day, and then I look at my Axios peers, and then I look at my non-Axios peers.
And on that note, there are so many great newsletters coming out and so many talented people writing about them. Do you worry about newsletter fatigue, that compounding on email fatigue, people just get too many newsletters?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And for me, one of the things that I'm grateful for is that I'm a reporter within a news organization, which gives me the resources to break news. One of the easiest ways, if you're a reporter, to combat newsletter fatigue is provide news that people have to get, and they're only going to get it in your newsletter. If you're just focusing on analysis, that can be tough because you have to provide like the strongest analysis out there. Whereas for reporters, it's not just providing strong analysis, although that is something we do. It's also about breaking news. And so I'm not so worried for me in terms of newsletter fatigue because I'm very strategic about holding my news for the newsletter. So it forces people to open it. But I think generally speaking, yeah, it's something that the industry is trying to combat because as everyone leans into the newsletter game, we're only going to have more and more competition. And so it might not be viable for everybody.
And on that note, with viability, Axios, I think, really shocked a lot of people by announcing they're profitable this year, or on the track to be, in a time when there's so much media carnage. How much of that revenue success comes from their newsletters?
Well, the vast amount of our revenue comes from advertising, and the majority, I believe, of our advertising revenue comes from newsletters. So it's highly attributable to our newsletters, our success. And I'd say in terms of profitability, one thing I like about Axios is that I think the company is a good reflection of my own personality, which is they invest a lot in their people and the relationships that they have with their company, making sure that we all have what we need. I thought it was really impressive. They created a $100,000 fund for anyone to tap into if there was an emergency related to COVID that you were facing. So they invest a lot there, but we don't spend our money on stupid stuff. I'll just be honest about that. We really don't. I mean, we are pretty strategic about don't take the Acela train if you don't have to take the Acela train. And so the reason I explain that is because profitability is not just a metric of how much money you make, but also about how much money you spend and how much money you're putting into the business. And we definitely invest, in my opinion, in the right stuff, which is we invest in our people, we invest in the well-being of our staff, we invest in our space, but we don't invest in silly things. And we're not having these really glitzy, holiday parties and things like that, because that's not where we think the investment needs to go. And that's why I think we've been able to hit profitability, this year. And I think also in terms of spending, bringing in revenue, we are very lucky at Axios. A lot of our money, a lot of our advertising dollars comes from people that are spending around corporate social responsibility. We have an audience that's very high level. It's investors, it's most people in Washington, members of Congress and regulators. And so if you're a big corporate Fortune 500 and you need to talk about your sustainability plan or what your plan is to combat systemic racism in the United States, we're a good outlet for that because the audience that we reach are your stakeholders. We don't have an audience, a commercial audience as much. We're not trying to really sell you a watch on Axios.com. Well, when the pandemic hit, a lot of companies that were reliant on selling goods struggled in advertising because media companies that sold advertising that was contingent on selling goods struggled because a lot of those companies pulled back that spend. But in the pandemic, a lot of companies doubled down on corporate social responsibility and advocacy advertising, and that's what Axios specializes in.
Nice. And now, of course, you've got this newsletter and a platform that's very desirable for others, and I'm sure they want to get there editorially. How often do you get pitched by people who want to be mentioned in your newsletter?
I get a lot of pitches. I don't do mentions. In my newsletter, I don't just mention you for the sake of being mentioned. Either I'm working on a story and I write about a story and the story is featured in the newsletter, or it's not. It's not like I randomly will do a, hey, this person moved to this job or this company did X, Y, and Z. I'd say you, like any other reporter, you're getting thousands of emails constantly all the time. I can take a look at what's on my phone here. I don't know if you can really see it. I have 434, I don't know if you could see it, 1,000 emails on my phone right now.
Oh yeah, I can see that. I could just see the really wide red notification. It looks terrifying.
So yeah, you get a lot of emails, but I'd say, for any public relations executives that are listening in, I think the best way to get a mention for your company is to pitch a strategic story, whether it's an exclusive or a really smart trend that an executive that you work with can speak to, and have work with me on a story about it that we can include. And the reason I don't do just listed mentions is because I really want to be mindful of my audience's time. And I think my audience can find lists other places, like you can find them on Twitter, you can find them in other newsletters, but finding really compelling analysis and breaking news, that's something I want people to think of when they come to our newsletter specifically.
And you touched on it with exclusives. We're always talking to PR executives and they're always wondering, do I give it to someone as an exclusive or do I just throw it out there and then pitch it? How important is it to do an exclusive, and how do you recommend people go about kind of offering it to a journalist like yourself?
I think exclusives are really helpful for a few reasons. One, it allows the stakeholder and the reporter to work on something together with time. One of the biggest things I struggle with is if someone sends me a press release like, hey, embargoed for 9 a.m. tomorrow, I might not have the time at that, given what we're working on, for me to even pay much attention to it. But if it's an exclusive, typically it's well thought out. You have a week or so or a few days to really work on it, to do some follow-up phone calls. That allows me to ask questions. So that's really helpful. And it allows me to bring my audience something new. And I think my audience really values things that they have not seen before. So exclusives, I think, are really important. And I think the other thing to be mindful of with exclusives is to really honor the exclusive with the reporter. There have been times where someone says, we'll give you the exclusive. And then, as soon as my piece posts, they post something to the wire. There's no problem with that, but it doesn't really feel exclusive. All the work that I did to do like these great interviews with your executives, we don't have the window of exclusivity to make it really have a punch. So that's something I'm mindful of.
That's a good point. So it's you view it as like this big investment you're putting in. So if it doesn't turn out to be as exclusive as pitched, it can make it feel burned. With that too, like when you get these emails, you showed me that terrifying notification above your mail app on your phone. What makes it stand out? Like, does the subject line matter a lot? The first line of the pitch, how long should it be? Like, what to you is a good pitch in your inbox?
Yeah, I think the subject line matters a lot. I think as soon as I open up an email and it's somebody explaining to me an industry trend or trying to tell me a story, I don't read any further because I likely know the trend, and it also makes it's a red flag to me that it's not customized. So the email will look something like, "Hey, Sarah, experts say that over $2 bajillion will be spent on political advertising this cycle. This study shows." It's like, I know that because, I'm involved in the space. What's more helpful is, "Hey, Sarah, my client is X, Y, and Z. We have an exclusive around a new product. Would you be open to learning more?" That's it. And if you don't hear back from me, like follow up and then I can give you an answer. I think those are the most effective emails because it gets at it very quickly what the action item is. If it's like 5 paragraphs explaining a trend, that's typically my eyes kind of gloss over that.
Great. One other question, and we're running short on time here, so I'm going to switch it back to the audience questions from Shalin, who's watching over YouTube. Asks, I write a newsletter about television and film perspective from a global perspective. American, Australian, British, Canadian, New Zealand. Television plays a huge part. Should I narrow the scope? And might be you might have to see more to give a full answer. But what's your general sense of like how both to Shalin's question specifically and in general, like how narrow should people be going now?
I think that if you pick an industry, that's pretty good. I mean, television and film production is pretty narrow within itself. It's not like you're trying to tackle all of entertainment at once. So I think that's actually really good. And then if you want to be a specialist within that, let's say you're really highly focused on production, international production, like you can have that be kind of the thing that's the pillar of your newsletter. But I actually think that's a great size. TV and film production is pretty good. It's more narrow than just all of TV and film, right? You're focusing on production. And it's not too narrow where you're focusing only on like camcorders used in video and production film. So I actually think that's like a perfect size. And then in terms of the global perspective, I focus mostly on the US. Sometimes I'll do global trends. Global can be really hard because it's so much. So the way that I recommend to people who do global or do global coverage is like, remember how I said at the beginning, I try to stack my newsletter between like politics, tech, sports, streaming, whatever. If you want to ever structure your newsletter to be something like, EMEA, and then take a look at maybe Southeast Asia, or look at different geographies, that can ensure that you're giving a diversity of places that you're covering globally without having one newsletter ever tilt too much into North America coverage or too much into China coverage, whatever.
Very cool. And we're pretty much at time. Sarah, do you have any final words of wisdom for all the aspiring newsletter writers listening who want to make it to inbox stardom like yourself?
Well, I'd say, first of all, like you have really good resources out there. Like Muck Rack is a great resource. So just the fact that you're listening to this stream, it tells me a lot. It tells me that you're really invested in learning and in capitalizing on some of those resources. And then the other thing I'd say is like, really try to take note of what you read, what you like and what you don't like, and make a list of, hey, I don't like how some of these newsletters get too long. And maybe you note that. And so when you start to carve out your own newsletter, you can refer back to a list of the things that you as a consumer have digest it over a period of time to help kind of inform your process.
Great advice. And Sara, just one last time, if we're not signed up yet, where do we sign up for your newsletter?
You are so kind, Greg. Thank you so much, by the way, for having me. This is really fun. You sign up at signup.axios.com.
Awesome. Well, Sara, thanks so much for coming on Muck Rack Live. We're a big fan, and it's an honor to have you.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. I'm a big fan as well. The admiration is mutual.
Have a wonderful weekend. Bye, everybody.
Bye.